Hi everyone, it's Christopher, Mono County Library Director and co-host of the Oxygen Starved podcast, and it's Book Talk Friday. And it's no secret that I love to read about history, both in fiction and nonfiction. One of the reasons is because history does repeat itself, and we can often understand the turmoils we're going through now by revisiting how people got through, or didn't get through, turbulent times in the past. It's also no secret that I like my history books like I like my steaks. Thick and juicy and well cooked. Which brings me to my first pick of the week, the novel Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. This came out 13 years ago to rave reviews, and it's the first in a trilogy that chronicles the rise and abrupt fall of Thomas Cromwell, the first everyman who pulled himself up by his bootstraps to become the right-hand man of the notorious King Henry VIII in England. I use the bootstrap analogy on purpose. Now, most people are familiar with Henry VIII as that half-mad womanizer who had 6 wives, 2 of whom he divorced and 2 of whom he had executed. But Henry's England was also the last great flowering of medieval culture before religious reformation and an expansion of education pushed the country well towards the Renaissance and serious cultural change. Thomas Cromwell was instrumental in helping the king divorce his first wife to allow him to marry Anne Boleyn, famously pushing that break with the Catholic Church to make it happen. Thomas was also a commoner, not a noble, which made his rise controversial, so he became adept at cultivating relationships and financial relationships with both honest and not so honest people. He recognized truth, but also weaponized rumor and falsehoods to his advantage, and he ingratiated himself with powerful people and pushed aside people who got in his way, no matter how powerful. And those included 2 queens in every Catholic church across England and Wales. Now, while Henry is notorious in histories for his treatment of his wives, Cromwell is notorious as responsible for the dissolution of the monasteries, that closing down of all those cathedrals and abbeys, seizing their wealth, and pushing the king as head of the church instead of the pope. This, of course, was the ultimate age of cancel culture, so when Cromwell pushed too far by accumulating too much influence and convincing the king to marry an obscure German princess sight unseen, Henry VIII famously backed out of it and in retribution arranged for Cromwell to be executed. Now, this trilogy has been adapted for stage and screen. It's incredibly well-researched and well-written and is one of the best historical fiction reads to come out in the last 20 years. It also leads me to my pick for the new this week. The Dissolution of the Monasteries, A New History by James Clark just came out last fall. Now, as I mentioned, England's break with the Catholic Church is often positioned as a side narrative to Henry VIII's dynastic ambitions. But this is the first book in a generation to actually look at what it meant. There were 850 cathedrals, abbeys, monasteries, and priories across England and Wales, and every single one of them went through the dissolution. Some of them went on to become new churches, some of them were handed to the king's supporters as personal property, and some of them were emptied of anything valuable and left to decay, becoming tourist destinations today. But what was the process? Did it really happen overnight at the king's whim? What were the valuables that were seized? And how did the regular people who had lived with these institutions for generations in their towns react? And really, what do you do with all those nuns and monks who suddenly have nowhere to live? Well, this book answers those questions in a pretty exhaustive and absorbing way. For one thing, many monasteries had been in decline for decades already. Remember, one of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation was the mismanagement of the existing churches, and many monasteries in England had only a handful of members and couldn't afford their own upkeep. In fact, some had already closed. The monks and nuns, who were ultimately displaced by the dissolution, were pensioned off for life, so many were only too happy to accept the money and leave. The government paid for these pensions out of the monastery's own property holdings, so while the crown technically got the spoils, much of the income was actually tied up for years in retirement payments to the former members of the houses. Speaking of spoils, there were certainly lots of precious metals and jewels to be had, but the most valuable spoil to the government were the lead in the roofs, which were sold off. Now, some of the buildings were handed to supporters of the king, and in coming decades, it was common for them to pull down the main part of the church and use those materials to build a new country house, often incorporating the old cloister buildings that would have been the sleeping quarters, the kitchens, and the dining halls, where the rooms were naturally smaller and more inhabitable. These were some of the first great stately homes of England. Now, there was some rebellion against the dissolution at the time, but not as much as people would think. The folks who perhaps paid the biggest price were the regular folks employed by the monasteries to do their farming and maintenance, who found themselves suddenly without livelihoods, a roof over their heads, or a lifetime pension. In fact, in the early days of the dissolution, when the government team started surveying all those individual monasteries around the country, it was a surprise just how many non-religious people lived and worked under their roofs. And when the real Protestant versus Catholic fighting conflicts broke out a century later, it wasn't because there was any drive to reinstate the monastic system in England. It was more just to allow Catholic beliefs and practices to be legal again. There's a lot more to be learned in this really terrific and absorbing The Dissolution of the Monasteries by James Clark. And there's a lot to be enjoyed in this terrific and absorbing history in novel form, Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Both terrific reads, both available at Mono County Libraries. Come in and grab these or another great history book to fall into. In the meantime, stay safe and happy reading.